You are walking down a wooded path early on a summer's evening. The light filtering through the canopy above has turned golden, dappling the path with low beams of orange light. The evening insects begin to sing their songs, unbothered by your journey through their forest cathedral. Eventually, you begin to hear new sounds, people laughing and singing up ahead. The walls of the trees on either side of you begin to thin, and up ahead you see a clearing. Your footsteps quicken as you sense your journey is at an end. The path weaves towards the clearing, and as you step around a tree, it unfolds before you. People all around with flowers and food. Some are bringing forth wood for a truly massive pyramid of sticks and logs, preparing for a bonfire. Welcome to Midsummer. Hi, guys, and welcome back to the BabaYaga, our podcast about history, culture, and sustainability. This week, we're diving into the Midsummer ritual. It's going to be super exciting and fertile. I, I am Devin. I have a master's in American legal history and Indigenous studies.
And I'm Sonya, and I'm working on a PhD in medieval history.
So this is going to be our first full episode. It's going to be all about Midsummer, which is a European festival, and so it will mostly be me interrogating Sonya.
Sounds good. I'm sitting in my chair. Devin's got the light shining directly in my face. I'm ready to answer any questions.
Excellent. Let's get into it on this sweltering summer evening. Okay, so to start off, Sonya, I guess we should really just explain what exactly Midsummer is, when it happens in the year, and just the sort of like basic introductory principle of Midsummer.
Absolutely. So, in the Northern Hemisphere, the summer solstice happens around June 22nd. This is when the North Pole is at its maximum tilt towards the sun, which creates the longest period of daylight in the year. Especially in the Arctic Circle, there can be continuous daylight around the summer solstice. And this word actually comes from the Latin sol stetit, which means the sun stood still. So it's this very ancient idea of kind of time and the sun itself stopping for a bit.
So, with this moment of pause that you're talking about with the solstice, do you want to tell us sort of like why we decided to start our journey through the year with Midsummer and the summer solstice
Yeah,
rituals?
so I thought it was important to start with the summer solstice because when we're looking at this project, a big part of it is looking at how different rituals, festivals, and sort of celebrations have changed over time and how we understand ourselves has changed with the passage of time. And I think the summer solstice is a really great place to start with something like that because it's such an old holiday. Like, this is a holiday that has been celebrated in some way or another for potentially thousands of years. There is some discussion that, Stonehenge was potentially part of a summer solstice solar kind of rituals. And we have this long history of it and how these festivals and rituals have evolved over time. And I think looking at how people have taken this central idea of, hey, it's warm and bright and nice outside again, and how they've used that in different contexts and in different ways that are meaningful to them.
I think that is awesome, like, especially since it's a holiday that is so joyful and focused on plenty, but also to be a pause, to have that moment of reflection in this space that is like bright and plentiful is, I think, a great place to start a year.
And I think it's really interesting how we see the summer solstice pop up. To quote a historian who will be using quite a bit of her work today, Natalie Kononenko, a ritual is an essential part of human existence. If suppressed by political or cultural forces, it can lie dormant for generations, but then, at the opportune time, reemerge. And we'll talk about the ways that the summer solstice and midsummer just keeps reemerging and reinventing itself as cultural celebration.
I love that. That's really beautiful. Well, then to sort of like get us, going into how this ritual has changed over time, I guess we should start with the pre-Christian European celebrations of the summer solstice. Um, do you have
Yeah,
information about? Yeah. So how what did those practices look like? How was the summer solstice sort of celebrated and recognized in a pre-Christian
there's
Europe?
definitely some analogs. In pre Christian and classical Europe, we do see a lot of sort of difference. In the Roman context, this was the celebration of Fors Fortuna. So, Fortuna was the goddess of fortune and sort of the personification of luck and chance. And she had the Wheel of Fortune, not to be confused with the game show. Um, but I mean that's where it's taken from, right? I mean, it's this symbol where you have your goddess Fortuna, and she spins the wheel at random. And as the positions change on the wheel, some people will suffer misfortune, while others will gain in luck, in wealth, and health. And it was very much this idea of, chance and change. And I think it makes sense that a lot of her celebrations were around June 24th. It's near the solstice. And particularly in Rome, the Romans would go down the Tiber River in boats to her temple and have celebrations there. And it was linked to this idea of the solstice being a time of great change, and the heavens themselves were changing. In going further north, you see in sort of the Germanic areas, Scandinavia, the British Isles, there does seem to be, I mean, there's not a lot of written sources for this, but there is evidence that there would have been some form of celebration, bonfires, perhaps, some kind of acknowledgement of the changing of the seasons in this way. And in Eastern Europe, you had what was called Kupala Night, which was another sort of ancient festival that involved rituals to do with water and bonfires. So it's again this idea of sort of the like light and warmth and plenty.
Cool. That's like really fascinating. It seems like there's a lot of diversity in the way that this was celebrated in the pre-Christian period. How did these holidays really start to change, with the spread of Christianity
I mean,
across
in
Europe?
some ways they did change, but in a lot of ways they stayed the same in a lot of aspects is the thing.
That's fascinating.
It's yeah, I mean it's the church obviously had a very vested interest in like Christianizing these pagan celebrations, right? Like you're not going to be very popular if you come in like if you roll into town and say, "Hey, you can't have fun anymore. You're not allowed to have celebrations." Like nobody is going to want to get on board.
Hmm.
um so like you don't want that. And there's also this public backlash when you do try to do that, right? Like so I mean, partially this was just a fully pragmatic move, right? But we also do see this theological concepts that come in with it because basically you get these theological ideas that Jesus' birthday, right? Christ comes into the world on December 25th, which is roughly the winter solstice.
Right.
And so you get these theological writings saying that Christ came into the world on that day because he was supposed to be, right, like that's the shortest day of the year, it's the most darkness, and Christ is the light of God who is coming into this dark world. And then every day after that gets longer and brighter because he brings light into the world,
Oh,
right?
yeah. Okay, that's
Yeah,
cool.
so then John the Baptist in the Bible is supposed to have been born 6 months before Jesus was, which puts him exactly at, you know, June 25th ish for the summer solstice.
Right, half birthday.
Yeah, exactly. They're half birthdays. So John the Baptist comes into the world on the longest day of the year, on Midsummer, but then every day after that gets shorter until you hit Christmas again, which is when Christ comes into the world and makes the light return, basically. So there was this theological idea that John the Baptist represents humanity and how all of us are mortal, and just like how every day after his birth gets shorter and shorter, our own lives get shorter, right? Like it's this idea of human mortality and fragility, and then in the cycle you have Christ who appears at the darkest time of the year to bring the light of God back into the world, basically.
Interesting. The half birthday sounds pretty bleak. Not gonna lie.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not gonna lie to you. John the Baptist, it's a it's a pretty bleak story all around for him, if we're being honest. I mean,
Yeah.
he lives by himself, lives off of like honey and insects, gets his head chopped off. You know,
Not a great time.
not a great time for John. Let's say that. But I mean, for a long time there, he got celebrated a lot.
Yeah, well,
So that was
that's a
great.
plus.
Yeah, So yeah, and one of the other reasons that John the Baptist was potentially associated with the solstice is because, again, he's a Baptist, right?
Yeah.
Like he's putting people into water, he's, washing away your sins. And a lot of these pre Christian rituals also would include an aspect of water, of ritual washing, bathing, swimming in sacred wells and ponds and that sort of thing. So
Wow.
there's also that idea tied into it.
Interesting. That's like, yeah, that's a pretty neat lineup there of, thematic relevance.
So this is sort of the first big shift we see in the summer solstice and midsummer, right? Where it's going from this pagan worship of pagan gods, the sun, the land, and instead is now being integrated into the Christian calendar year and a Christian celebration.
Yeah, so I'm like really interested in that part of the shift because the it's interesting that the pagan holiday is really very much about these physical things, the sun, the movement of the planet, the land, and people's relationship to the land and the sun. And the Christian calendar is very the theology around it is very removed from the corporeal, and I'm interested in
Yes.
how you take such physical practices and they become more representational of this very like spiritual calendar, of remembering people, saints, Christ, all of those things from what was these pagan practices about the physical nature of life and time.
Yeah, so I think it's, especially in the earlier Middle Ages, it's a much more porous kind of idea, right? Like
Yeah.
people were Christianized very slowly, and in a lot of cases, we have these, in a lot of cases you had people where it was very much a like, oh, yeah, sure, like Jesus sounds cool, we'll add him to the pantheon, like why not?
Jesus,
Or
one of many.
yeah, I mean it really was like there's um different stories of you know, people and villages going and, there's building a church, but then, also doing some pagan stuff on the side because, like, you want to hedge your bets a bit. Um,
Pagan stuff on the side.
you know,
You can
like
you
you,
can
you
have a
go
little
to
paganism as a treat.
Absolutely, I mean, you've got your Thor's hammer pendant. You flip that upside down, Devin, it's a cross.
Ooh, there
Like,
we go.
and the other thing is, you have this very much syncretic beliefs, right, for a
Yeah,
long time, and this sort of a lot of the time integration of folk beliefs, and that's done very, very intentionally.
right.
Because again, if you roll into town and say, throw out everything you ever knew, we have a new religion for you, most people are going to tell you, get out, buddy.
Yeah.
Like, no thanks. Whereas instead, in a lot of ways, there were ways that certain aspects of sort of the traditional culture and traditional practices would get sort of absorbed into Christianity. And that was the norm for a long, long time. But I mean, also, as the Middle Ages wear on, you do start to see more and more sort of Christianized versions of things and less pagan belief in general.
Interesting.
And that's just a. Oh, sorry. I didn't mean to cut you
No,
off.
I'm just saying that that's really cool.
Yeah, and, because a lot of it is like, right, let's say your first generation, the missionary or the priest comes into the village, they start preaching, they build a church, and, that first generation kind of tolerates it and is like, sure, whatever. But, the kids who are growing up with this, right, like this is their norm, and then their kids grow up, and over time, right, you're getting less and less of pagan belief that is surviving and more Christian belief, basically, that is becoming the norm in the community. Right? So, like, even as time goes on, a lot of these older cultural practices and customs stay the same, but now they've taken on these new meanings because you've had these generations that are growing up with Christianity as their religion, right?
Yeah.
Like,
So the like you have a shift from this is literally going to help fertilize the earth to this is how, we represent our like spiritual connection to God.
I mean, I think it kind of becomes a both and. Because especially before the Protestant Reformation, like,
Hmm.
there is not a hard line between what is sort of spiritual and what's physical, right? So, take for example a lot of magic in the Middle Ages, right?
Oh, right,
Like,
yeah.
there was natural magic, and that was seen as a good thing because if you were someone
Hmm.
who had the education to know, well, this kind of plant, like these are the properties of these plants and these are the properties of these minerals or this kind of animal, and you could use that to bring about
Hmm.
good luck, good harvests, that was seen as fine and good because God created the world. God said that everything was good. So as long as you were using natural items,
Hmm.
basically, you were in the clear. Whereas magic was only bad if it was dark magic or magic that involved you, making a pact with the devil or trying to summon a demon or something, right?
Right.
And it's really not until the Protestant Reformation that there's any issue whatsoever seen with, like, natural magic practices and Christianity. Like, that's not really an issue in the Middle Ages for the most part.
Okay.
Like,
That's so cool.
yeah.
So there's yeah, so that's where you can really see how syncretic the early European, like, pagan to Christian ideas were, that it was pretty easy to map Christianity onto these pre-existing rituals.
Yeah, absolutely. And it didn't necessarily mean that you weren't genuinely Christian, which is something that comes about much later. We
Mm-hmm.
see this, this is essentially Protestant Reformation propaganda in the 1500s saying, oh, well, these people are going and they have their sacred springs. So, secretly they're pagans. But then, what happens a few centuries later? You get Protestants opening up healing spas where, the water is good for you if you go into it.
Ah, fascinating.
So
Okay.
it's very much this it's very much this cyclical kind of thing where you do get these hard line ideas that show up in the 1500s, but then by the time the 17 and 1800s roll around, it's beginning to soften again.
Okay. Oh, that's so cool.
But yeah, so I mean, I think you kind of end up with this both and situation to come back to
Yeah.
fertilizing the fields and stuff, right? Where like
The physical and the spiritual existing at once in one ritual.
yeah, exactly, because you do have people saying, well, okay, no, we do need to perform these rituals in order to ensure a good harvest, but it's also being seen as spiritual in that like ultimately it is the Christian God who decides on like the outcome of the world and his plans, right? So it's sort of
Right.
this overlap of ideas.
So then, like, what does the rituals and celebrations like actually look like? Like, what are people doing? What is the actual ritual that we're talking about?
All right. First things first, you got to get rowdy.
Oh man.
The all of these festivals included basically different forms of breaking social norms. This could be by
All about that.
right. People would verbally attack and insult the authority figures. People would get drunk, they'd get rowdy, they'd dance, they'd maybe flirt and be a little more, just a little let loose a little bit. um, right?
Wow.
Anybody who was living in a town, right, they would hold these festivals outside the city limits, out in the fields, because technically the city didn't have jurisdiction to basically like do anything about their behavior, so it was quite literally a lawless festival.
Oh man. Finding the loopholes. I love
Right?
Midsummer.
And
Getting
there's a
crazy.
lot of issues in the Middle Ages where you have these towns that like try they'll sort of try to crack down on it occasionally. And then yeah, everyone
Yeah.
just goes outside and is like, "Well, we're outside of your jurisdiction now, so you can't do anything about it."
Catch me outside. How about that? Oh, that's great. I really love the idea of the sort of subverting authority roles at this time. Like this moment of pause to deal with your issues with authority, and especially in these, like, feudal states. Like,
Yeah,
that's awesome. Have that
exactly.
moment.
It's this time where you can sort of push back against these social norms. And I mean, again, we're going to quote Natalie Kononenko because she's just this is great. quote, ritual tends to be a time outside time and thus a period out of the ordinary. Normally prohibited behaviors are sanctioned, making ritual a natural vehicle for escaping oppression.
That's so cool. And it reminds me of, because we're talking about the sort of dual nature of Midsummer and Christmas, it reminds me of like
Yes.
traditional caroling, coming up to the wealthy or managerial or feudal lord's house and literally just singing for food and stuff and saying, "We're not going to go away until you give us
Yeah.
pudding." Like, I I love that there's that at both ends of this seasonal year.
Yeah, it's a very nice, like, we have these very sanitized ideas of Christmas, especially, I think. But yeah, I mean, historically in
Yeah.
context, these were often very subversive holidays, and they were a time when you could, push back a bit on what was the established norm.
Oh, that's so great. And I think that's like a wonderful idea to, really bring into life, especially right now in turbulent
Yes.
times, that we can use these ritual practices, these ancient practices, as a way to think about and engage with our relationships with authority and what is a like valid moment of authority, and to take midsummer as a period of pause to really think about that. I think is incredibly poignant and timely.
Yeah, I really like that.
So other than getting rowdy and drunk, what were people doing? I mean, we talked about before that this was um, a ritual of fertility and the land. How were people bringing that into the physicality of the rituals, other than
Yes.
going out and essentially having a bush party?
Um, I mean, the first big thing is, as you said, fertility, right? Um, let's start with fertility of the land. So, in a lot of cases around midsummer, you see these rituals around bonfires. And, this is happening throughout Europe throughout the Middle Ages. St. John's Night is incredibly popular and just dotted throughout the whole landscape on that night from
Yeah.
everywhere. You would see people setting up these huge bonfires. And the idea was that this was supposed
Mm-hmm.
to sort of ritually and also, but also quite literally, it was supposed to cleanse the area. It was supposed to drive away everything from witches to demons to dragons, and sort of also was supposed to kind of bring down blessings upon you and upon your land. So there's this idea of fire and this light and warmth, and kind of using that both as protection and as a, a way to bring favor to your land and the village's communal land.
Oh, I like that, like physical representation of the getting rowdy as well, with the destruction as cleansing
Yes.
and rebirthing. So like with the social aspect as well, and then coming into the physical relationship with the physical land is amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. And you also then had fertility, right, as the fertility of the people in your village. So,
Oh.
yup. So, this is also a lot of the time when we actually still see at this point the links to Fors Fortuna in the Roman tradition, because you get a
Okay.
lot of this fortune telling, but it all has to do with young women and young men of marriageable age and like finding out what your life is going to look like. So
Oh, there we go.
there was, like in Sweden, there was a midsummer tradition that, I mean, it might still be happening now, where girls would pick 7 flowers from 7 different fields, and then you would put the
Okay.
flower under your pillow on Midsummer Night Eve. And that night um, you are supposed to get a vision of your future husband in your dream.
Oh, wow.
But then there's also, in the Eastern European context, you also have these sorts of fortune telling slash matchmaking rituals.
Mm-hmm.
So, in some villages, it was traditional, and this is actually something that still happens today, where all the unmarried, but yeah, all the unmarried girls in the village would make these wreaths of flowers and then attach candles onto them. And then you light
Okay.
the candles and send them floating out onto a river or a lake. And based on the direction of which way the wreath floated, that could indicate, you know, when the girl was going to get married or which one was going to get married first. When the candle burnt out would signify how long her life was going to be.
Oh my gosh.
Yep. So if your candle went out first, you'd be the first to die, and then vice versa
Oh,
if your
that's
candle
morbid.
went out last. But there's also traditions of then the wreaths being put out to float, and then the unmarried boys in the village running out to grab them. So then,
Oh,
you know,
that's
who
cool.
the if a boy
Yeah.
wanted to be with a certain girl, he could go out and try to get her wreath.
Yeah.
There's also, again from Eastern Europe, a ritual around a bonfire where unmarried couples would
Mm-hmm.
hold hands and jump over the bonfire together, like once it had burnt down a little bit. They're
The,
not.
the embers.
Yes, like the embers slash, like, the fire is still going, but it's not like, you know enormous, because
Yeah.
safety. Um, so if you were able to hold hands and you could both jump across the fire without letting go of your hands, that meant that you would marry within the coming year.
Oh, wow.
So there's a lot of emphasis both on sort of the fertility of the land, but also the fertility of the people within the village, and sort of making these matches and making these marriages. Kind of another nod to fertility is the fertility of the sort of natural world, the uncultivated plants. Um,
Ah, right. Because this is when like things are coming into bloom and
yes,
trees in the forest are bursting into life and your allergies are acting up and
getting all that pollen in your
sorry, that
face.
might have been a little personal. My experience of Midsummer.
Well, that's because you haven't done the right rituals, Devin. Have you hung nettles in your
Uh,
windows?
I do not know where I would find nettles, but I'll
Well,
try.
go find some and hang them in your window, and that's going to prevent the witches from cursing you.
Oh, right, it's not
Obviously.
pollen, it's a curse.
Yeah.
I've been cursed.
But I mean, we see in Sweden and a lot, like, out throughout Scandinavia, people would have a maypole that's covered in flowers, right? So you have this
Hmm.
very phallic symbol that is being planted into the earth and is covered with flowers, which are a plant's reproductive organs.
Ah, this is such a subtle holiday.
Right? It's very, very subtle about the fertility bit. But we also have, again, in um, the Ukrainian and Eastern European context, you have the idea of the magical fern flower. So at
Fern
midnight
flower.
on St. John's Night, there is supposed to be a magical fern that blooms in the forest, and it makes a single red flower, and it only lasts while the clock is striking 12 at midnight. So young people would go into the forest and search for this blooming fern. If you were able to find the red flower and then carry it back out of the forest, safely because, midsummer could also be a time when, there's maybe demons and witches floating around. So obviously you have to protect your flower. If you were able to successfully do that, you would be able to have this flower that was supposed to bring you wealth and health and a long, happy life. So, again, we're seeing the fertility of not only the land and the people, but also this idea of the plants that are growing not just wildly, but even magically.
Interesting. And so this is the red flower that is so popular in like Eastern European artistic and folk motifs, like
Yes.
that you'd see in embroidery and on pottery and stuff.
In some cases, yes. In others, that's more so poppies, which is also
Oh,
very
okay.
popular. But I will say a lot of music out of Eastern Europe, there are a lot of like romantic love songs talking about the red fern flower.
Aw, that's so nice.
Yeah, no, my favorite is the one where it's a man singing to a woman saying basically don't bother going and looking for this red flower because our love is all we need and I already have the perfect life with you.
Aw,
It's
that's
really cute.
beautiful. Aw. That's like a
But I
much
mean,
much cuter version of the Beatles like "Can't Buy Me Love."
yes. And also, just to kind of bring it back to the fertility of the people, I would also like to point out that this would have been, one of the few sanctioned times when, like, young people could just be alone together.
Ah, there we go.
So it's again, we're bringing it back to this, like, this is a time when things that normally are not allowed
Right,
are
unchaperoned.
happening. Yeah, you get to be unchaperoned in the woods, like, hmm.
Ho ho, under the moonlight.
Exactly. It's very romantic. You're looking for the love fern flower.
Aww, that's so pretty.
Yeah.
So then I guess my other question is like, so where then does in all of this romantic woodland frolicking does John the Baptist come in?
Well, again, this is sort of circling back to what I was saying later or earlier. This is circling back to what I said earlier where, in a lot of ways you do have this sort of, veneer of Christianity
Mm-hmm.
added to it, which does become important over time. A lot of cities did have religious processions involved. Florence, notably, had religious processions for John the Baptist. You would maybe have a church service, that kind of thing. Also, there were typically, in a lot of these cases, aspects of cleansing yourself with water.
Okay, there we go.
So, you would go to the holy spring and bathe, or people would go swimming, or wash off certain parts of it was a time to basically clean yourself, both ritually and literally. There's also there would be effigies constructed in certain instances of this. And then those effigies would actually end up being dismembered and drowned by throwing them into a body of water.
That's
So
a little morbid.
it's a bit morbid, but that's you gotta do what you gotta do. And in other cases, you would dismember your effigy and then scatter the pieces around the fields to ensure
Okay,
a good harvest.
interesting.
So you see these different sort of layers of ritual happening, right? Like we go from a pagan holiday that is outwardly religious to a Christianized version of this holiday that still retains a lot of pagan aspects, but also has Christian aspects added to it. and over time we see sort of the pagan aspects lose that meaning, at least for the vast majority of people, and just become in many ways a secular holiday. Like even in the context of the Middle Ages, like this was a relatively secular holiday as compared to many others in the Christian calendar.
Right. Like Easter, what have you.
Yeah, because I mean, you look at, say, Easter or Christmas, like in the Middle Ages, right? It involves a lot of church service and a lot
Mm-hmm.
more overt religiosity as compared to Midsummer, where yeah, it's a lot of it is going outside the city limits and getting drunk, like,
A much more
and
like
just having a good time.
social uh, holiday and ritual.
Yes, it's very much a social holiday and ritual. And it also, in a lot of ways, had very practical purposes, like, matchmaking, so that your
Yeah.
future of the village is ensured, so that you have these couples. Another big part of it was the gathering of herbs. This is recorded both in Denmark and in early medieval England. Um, there are, like, this was the night when sort of the wise men, wise women, the kind of village doctor was supposed to go out and gather all of the different herbs and flowers and plants that would be needed for the upcoming year to treat medical conditions.
Right. That's so cool.
Because, again, yeah, there's this idea of there are certain times of the year where this is the better time of the year to harvest this.
Yeah. And everything's coming into bloom, so there's like the practicality of knowing that there will be plenty.
Yes, and it's also this practicality of knowing that there's plenty, but also also there's a lot of astrology involved in it,
Okay.
and because this is again something that we see from the classical world that gets relatively Christianized, because basically you get this idea that, well, okay, God created the heavens, the stars, so obviously if you know how to look for those signs and say, oh, well, this is the summer solstice and this is when the days are the longest, which means that this is the correct time to go out and gather all these plants, because this is when they're at their best, and then I can preserve them for the coming year, because I'll have sort of captured that moment of power.
Little
Hey.
question. um, Yay. About so this the effigy that's being torn up and drowned and the bonfires. Is this like the the combination of these things? Is that sort of where we get this pop culture idea of like the Wicker Man that was in horror movies and things like that? Did you look
I
at
did
that at
not look
all?
at that, but I mean,
Okay.
I do think you could probably pretty easily draw a line from like these ideas to the present, because we still see a lot of these things echoed in our present in ways that we don't necessarily think about. Like,
Yeah.
right? Like even today we know that like June is sort of the height of wedding season. Like,
Yeah, that's
right? Like,
so
why do we
interesting.
have all these flowers at our weddings? Like, why do we get married in June? Like, we have central heat and air now. You could get married any time of year, and yet,
Yeah. That's so cool the way that these things like hold over into our modern lives. So then talking about that, about the way that these things have sort of flown, like the way that these things have continued to exist in our modern lives in ways that we might not expect them to, are there ways that it is overtly still being celebrated or people performing these rituals still in Europe or
well, in some
anywhere?
cases, yes. Like, it's still very common throughout Scandinavia to have these midsummer rituals, and There are places in Eastern Europe, specifically Ukraine and Belarus, that have brought back Ivan Kupalo night, which is the um, John the Baptist uh,
Okay.
translated. And in that case, it's actually really interesting because there is sort of this new wave of people in. I don't know as much about Belarus, but in Ukraine specifically, from what I was reading, where this festival in particular was sort of used as a way to carve out this post Soviet identity. Because this celebration was actually officially banned in the Soviet Union.
Oh wow. Like
Um,
totally?
yeah, like it was completely banned. You weren't allowed to do this, right? Because
Wow.
when the Soviet Union is starting off, right,
Mhm.
like all the divination that was going on, dancing around bonfires, this sort of thing, this was anathema in a society that was supposed to be like this workers' utopia where we don't have superstition anymore. We're scientifically advanced. We're not going to do these like peasant village rituals, right?
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't really work with state socialism to have another power that isn't that's that state.
Exactly, and it also ran really counter to um, like the enforced collectivized farming, right? Because you go from
Right.
right? Like you look at a traditional like Ukrainian village, it's farmers are working with their land in very specific ways and there are these ancient traditions. You're probably, tending your fields in a very certain way and you have this kind of connection with your land and working it. Whereas the collective farms, right, it was basically trying to set up a factory farming system in a lot of ways.
Yeah, the
Um,
forced industrialization of agriculture.
Yeah, exactly. And obviously, in an industrialized farm, there's no place for people to be like scattering the remnants of a torn up effigy to make the crops grow better, right?
Yeah, it's less a relationship with the land and more an extraction.
Yes, it becomes this much more um it's or at least it was supposed to become this much more like the land is a tool to be used rather than this land is a part of our community and something that we love and that we care for.
That's so interesting. And so then with the fall of the Soviet Union, you say that there's a resurgence. So is that I'm assuming that it's not people just coming out and being like, I am one with nature, but more of like a uh, like nationalist or uh, like rebuilding a community and identity.
Yeah, it was in a lot of ways not. I think, again, it's a situation where, on one hand, you have. It was very meaningful for people on more than one level because there
Yeah.
had been people who had continued to do aspects of this throughout the Soviet period.
Mm-hmm.
Um, because in a lot of ways, right, like you can like sure you can crack down on building a giant bonfire, but you're not going to go house to house and like check that no one's hanging herbs in the window, like, or
Yeah.
check that, right, like, because that was also part of it, was decorating your house with these different, with different greenery and flowers. And it's like, well, you can't really enforce that. That's just not practical at that point.
Yeah.
Especially in the context of like World War II and the aftermath. It's like we don't
Oh
have time
gosh.
for this. Like we don't have the resources to enforce every little thing. And
Yeah.
yeah, there was even already in like the 70s there had been a little bit of easing off where people were starting to be allowed to kind of practice some of these rituals again because there was this renewed interest in like and sort of a softening of regulations towards you know traditional cultural practices. But yeah, we see in the post Soviet period this revival of this ancient crop ritual that, in a lot of ways, was about affirming your identity, right? Because you want to have these rituals that you feel like are your own and that you get to celebrate in your own way. Especially because in the Soviet Union, right, when there were celebrations
Mm-hmm.
and, official holidays, but most of these performances and festivals would feature, the main focus would be on Russian traditional dress, traditional songs. Like Russians would have the center stage, whereas everyone else from the other countries would be sort of peripheral, right? Like you were
Yeah.
not the focus there. So this in a lot of ways was about sort of local and to an extent nationalistic pride of people saying, no, we're going to have our own culture again, and we're going to celebrate things the way we always had in our village, and do things in this way. So in a lot of ways it was this it's come back not necessarily as a religious holiday in any
Mm-hmm.
sense, but more so as this sort of community community holiday that's about affirming your identity and as a form of sort of resistance to Russian hegemony.
Oh, that's so beautiful. I think that's interesting that, so in this post-Soviet way, that it is very much about like reclaiming this relationship with the land, because the as far as I know, the only real uh, midsummer practice in, or like continued, not real, but like continued extensive practice of midsummer um, in North America is in Quebec with Saint Jean Baptiste as the Fête de Nationale, so the holiday of the nation of Quebec.
Oh, interesting.
Um, because they're and this could be, I could be wrong about this, but I have not found an indigenous holiday that is like directly analogous to the European midsummer.
Mm-hmm.
But in Quebec, um, in the mid 19th century, with the Patriot movement, of sort of, like trying to create a government in Quebec that was run by the Quebecois, by the French Canadians.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you have a newspaperman who he ran Le Minerve, the one of the Patriot newspapers, essentially want to have a festival that was for French Canadians to celebrate their French Canadian identity in the way that Irish Canadians were able to with St. Patrick. And so that's why they chose the John the Baptist Day, Saint Jean Baptiste. And it started out as like a parade of all of these, you know, community organizations um, in the French Canadian communities to like celebrate being French Canadian in this time when they were like very much um, oppressed by an English regime. And throughout the century, it became more and more important. And in 1924, officially became the national holiday of Quebec, um, because Quebec, exists as a sort of national identity within the Confederacy of Canada,
Mm-hmm.
and then became even more important with the Quiet Revolution in the 1960s. That you know made it so that Quebec is a French-speaking province, that the French culture is very deeply protected in France, and this Fête Nationale has always been like really important. And there's like whole songs and stuff. This is the celebration where "O Canada" came from, and other songs about how wonderful it is to be French Canadian. But it's not a like agriculture based. it's very much about like parades and processions and this political identity rather than like what it was as Midsummer, which I think is like an interesting
Hmm.
transition.
No, I think that's, yeah, I think it's fantastic. And I think, yeah, I mean, we see that it is sort of this continuation of this idea of Midsummer slash St. John the Baptist Day as this holiday of kind of resistance of the norm and of pushing back against oppression and against hegemony, basically.
Yeah, I love that. I think that is definitely in our quest to find what historical rituals we want to bring into contemporary life. I think that is at the top of the list.
Yeah, I really,
Any ritual we can fight oppression with.
I think ritual as resistance is a very important and valid thing.
So then, Sonia, is there anything in our conversation um, about this? This has really been your episode that we didn't talk about, or that you want to like really sort of drive home as a little conclusion.
Yeah, I guess the thing I really want to drive home is this idea that people don't just engage in rituals and engage in traditions just because it's something they've always done. Rituals have meaning, and that meaning can change over time, but that doesn't make it not important to the people who are doing it. And we see this, I think, really, really well illustrated in Midsummer, which then becomes St. John the Baptist Night, which now has, in a lot of places, sort of changed form again into, as we said, in some places becoming more of a like cultural slash national pride type of holiday rather than being about necessarily religion or crop fertility or anything like that. And I just think it's really important to keep that in mind, that you can hold on to different parts of the past and just use the parts that are working for you, basically.
Yeah, which is, I mean, really our mission in this project. Which, speaking of which, we're going to start the blog as well. Just a little bump for our blog. We're going to have a couple of summer craft projects that we're going to work through, and Sonia is going to have a recipe.
Yes, we're going to attempt some
Right?
historical recipes.
Yes, so that you can bring these rituals into your life without having to start a major fire
Although, if you really want to,
as well.
just go outside your city limits.
Just go outside your city limit.
They can't stop you there.
I am not going to advocate arson. We did talk about this before. We are not advocating arson on our podcast.
Well, you know.
Well, on that note, we can get back to ritual as resistance. If you do want to get involved in the massive organized resistance that is happening across North America and now the world, there are some very easy financial ways you can do that, or you can volunteer with any of these organizations as well. Yeah, so the National Bail Fund, your local bail fund, any of the Black Lives Matter affiliated groups, the NAACP and the ACLU, especially the ACLU, is really going hard on litigating the aggression toward protesters that is happening with the police in the United States. So if you would like to volunteer, or if you have the funds to donate with that, and of course, if it is safe for you to do so, take a stand with the other protesters across North America and across the world.
And until next week, stay safe, take care of each other, and do what you can to make the world a slightly better place.